And as much as it's been a cost-sensitive market, what does it really cost for your business to be down for 3 or 4 days?
Yeah.
Then the price conversation is very, very different. Where does your data actually sit? Those are the things. So as an organization, you need to also understand the technologies you're deploying and where those technologies actually store data. So the one area that we are seeing a lot of recently, not just recently, over the past sort of 10, 12 months, I suppose, vandalism is on the up. And we're not just seeing it, we're starting to see it in East Africa. We've seen it for a long time in South Africa. So I think as an industry, we need to get together and understand how we deal with vandalism.
Good afternoon and welcome to ITWeb TV. I'm Tredger, and today in the studio with me I have Prenesh Padayachee, the Chief Digital and Operations Officer at Seacom. Thanks for joining us, Prenesh.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
Prenesh, can you tell us a little bit more about your role at Seacom?
Yeah, Chris. So as the Chief Digital Officer at Seacom, I'm in charge of IT and systems, technology, both on the network front, terrestrially and subsea. I'm also in charge of cybersecurity, so the cybersecurity practice for the organization sits with me, and then the global operations part of the business sits with me as well.
I see. It's an extensive role that you're playing. Can we begin with a little bit of detail about network outages and, when the lines go down, Seacom has to come in and rectify things. Can we talk about redundancy, data integrity, and risk mitigation?
Yeah, sure. So as you would have seen, we've had a torrid time on not just in South Africa, but the African continent over the last sort of 10 months or so, multiple outages, both on the East Coast and the West Coast from a subsea perspective.
Right.
And there's been a multitude of issues, from subsea rockfalls through anchor drags from vessels to trawling activity. So that's caused the majority of the issues that we've had over the last while. But if I just break that down, so you look at the East Coast, and that activity in the Red Sea has caused us problems, and not just us, caused multiple cable issues in the Red Sea area. Then there was the rockfalls on the West Coast, which took out a number of cables on the West Coast, and we've had 2 of those in the last few months. And what that's highlighted for us is the need for terrestrial connectivity through the continent. As much as we've had lots of cables come onto the continent, lots of capacity come onto the continent, with the To Africa cable coming online, with the Google Equiano cable coming online, both East Coast and West Coast, we've got loads more capacity on the continent now that we had than we had previously. And
what about the risk mitigation aspect of it? How can you try and plan when there's a failure and what happens afterwards?
It's so difficult to plan around the failure scenarios because, as I said, there's multiple scenarios to deal with. But what we as Seacom do is, if you look at just the subsea components of it, we've got capacity on both coasts. We've got access to 2 cable systems on both coasts. But we go a level further than that as well. We also go down to the level of vendor independence across the coast. So we use different vendors on the one coast as compared to the other. And that just mitigates for us as well. At a component level, at a software level, all of those sort of things that you start to need to look at when it comes to building networks. We also do that terrestrially. So multiple vendors terrestrially, different vendors on the equipment side of things. And then we tend to build our networks in a very diverse fashion, using multiple sort of routes. If you take South Africa as the example, we even go down into load shedding schedules just to make sure that we have sufficient power for capacity between the major nodes in the country.
I'm with you. And where do you see the subsea cable environment evolving in Africa? Is it going to be Google or Facebook that will drive the growth, or is it going to be from specialist telco players like yourself?
I think it'll be a blend of all of those. So the telco players, in conjunction with the large hyperscalers, will start to play a much more significant space in this market. I do think, though, that if you look at the terrestrial connectivity, I do think the telco players will play a much more larger load than the hyperscalers.
Right.
And once we get to that, because the hyperscalers will bring the content to the country, but how do you get it to the landlocked countries and the likes?
Precisely.
Now you look at the number of countries we have on the continent, many of them are landlocked. How do you get access to those landlocked countries? And I think there's the collaboration between the hyperscalers and the telco players across the continent.
Very good. And I mean, that really plays into what I was going to ask you, which is an ongoing theme, really, with that it's all well and good to have the land connections that are coming in, this capacity that you speak about.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a need for attention to get the connectivity to the masses. And the immediate implication is that the connectivity and infrastructure, all that capacity must be distributed a bit better, right? It must hit rural areas, people where there's a need, underserved areas and regions. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And here, so if you just look at the continent itself, we sit at roughly about 70% connectivity across the continent. But once you start to look at that, and you've rightly covered it, rural areas are very sparsely connected. But then it does come down to geography as well. So here, what we start to look at is a multitude of technologies that allows us to connect these underserviced areas. There's satellite, multitudes of satellite available. There's wireless connectivity available. But as you get to these technologies, you still need to have high-speed fiber connectivity to be able to get it from those areas to other areas.
Right.
So what it comes down to is what's the application today in that rural area that you're trying to deliver? For one, I can tell you, you're not trying to deliver high-quality 4K TV, as an example. Some of the basics, we need to get some of the basics. That's not just a South African problem, it's a problem across the continent.
Yeah.
But what I do think will solve those issues is as you build out networks, when you get between the major cities, what you'll find is that you do traverse a multitude of rural areas anyway.
Right.
So as part of your build strategy, and we do this all the time, as part of your build strategy, understand which rural areas you're covering and cater for that capability rather than an afterthought.
And that is pivotal to whatever happens from an African or South African perspective.
Absolutely.
Right, in terms of infrastructure, connectivity. Just if we could go over the satellite aspect a little bit more, what is your thoughts on the satellite sort of industry, service delivery via satellite? Is the market waking up to the opportunity that satellite affords?
I think the market's always been aware of the opportunity that satellite provides. I think with the advent of LEO satellites now, the low Earth orbit satellites, those start to open up different corridors. It solves some of the latency issues, solves some of the bandwidth issues. But then if I take that back into rural areas, are you really looking at latency and bandwidth in rural areas? When someone has zero connectivity, you'd rather give them some connectivity. So if you look at the satellite market, I think the satellite market's changed quite a bit over the last while with LEOs coming in. But even if you look at GEOs, the ability and the technology in GEOs today is vastly different to what it was 10 years ago. So all of those things start to come into play as well.
Can we shift our focus a little bit towards security, cybersecurity and network redundancy? What are your thoughts in terms of those very key aspects of business functionality?
So let me talk about cyber, then I'll talk about network redundancy after that. So when it looks at cyber, cyber will be around cyber criminals have been around for a long time.
Right.
And they continue to be more prevalent on the continent now than they've been previously. Whether it's phishing attacks, ransomware attacks, any of those, they start to be more prevalent. And it's across all sectors. Yes. Financial services, mining, telcos, all the sectors. You'd seen recently there's a whole bunch of articles around public sector and the sort of effects on public sector as well. So I think as those attacks become more sophisticated, the users of the infrastructure need to become more sophisticated as well.
Yeah.
So certain aspects of cyber that are vitally important. For one, make sure that you have policy and procedure in place. Should you have an attack? Yes. What are you going to do in that space? Staff awareness is a key driver to this. Are your staff aware of the various types of attacks? What an attack will look like? What to do when you get attacked? Those types of areas. And then partner with organizations that have the ability to deal with this. Cybersecurity is such a specialist area. Very much a specialized area. Resources in that space, very similar. And we'll probably get into an AI topic later on. AI as well, very similar. Not much skill around, not just in Africa or South Africa, it's around the world.
Yes.
Very little skill in these areas, but they've become a critical part of business in a critical area that needs to be looked at diligently.
I think it's really about, like you say, about understanding and identifying the weak spots, in the chinks in your armor for security, your posture, security, cyber security posture. There's a lot that we can talk about there as well. But I think if we could talk about data integrity now, it's important. It's critical. Data protection, where's your sovereignty in the whole equation? What do you think about that?
So primarily, I think regulation will drive that. From a technology perspective, there's many technologies out there today that give you that capability. Now, if you look at the Seacom network today, that network is built from the ground up to be able to comply with all of these things. So it's a matter of choice as to whether you want to turn it on or not. Right. And what we are seeing across the continent is that regulation in various territories is what drives it.
Right.
Data sovereignty, I think it'll become much more prevalent as we progress.
Yes.
And with that, and I think it's in certain sectors. So financial services, most definitely, that will become a key area. Mining may become a key area because of the resources involved in that. I don't think it'll be a widespread thing across all sectors, but it may become in certain countries. And I think it depends how sort of democratized the country is or how liberal the country is as to whether data sovereignty is across all sectors or only key sectors in that economy.
And I think public-private partnerships are going to be key going forward in terms of this space and regulation and how companies are able to deal with that and what their strategy is and, that kind of thing.
Yeah, but Chris, it becomes a difficult thing because if you look at this and lots of people move to cloud today.
Right.
So I'll take a great example. Lots of business today are based on Microsoft products. And if you look at the Microsoft products and where they sit globally today, it's not necessarily sitting in every country across in fact, the instances on the African continent is very sparse.
Right.
If you look at all of these hyperscalers, their instances on the continent is very sparse. So if you are a Microsoft user and you've chosen Microsoft, and many organizations have, where does your data actually sit? Those are the things. So as an organization, you need to also understand the technologies you're deploying and where those technologies actually store data. And that data in the world we live in today, that data moves around as well.
Yes.
Just from a redundancy. So as you build in redundancy, you want to have the ability to move the data around.
Right.
But then you bring the sovereignty aspect into this, and it becomes a very difficult situation to manage. It's a juggling act, absolute juggling act. And then if I start to break that down, where do you actually then put the bandwidth that you require? Because it's an unpredictable aspect as to how do I cater for a load suddenly overnight shifting from one area to another. So lots of sort of work that we do in that space around capacity planning, how workloads will shift, where does data actually reside.
Right.
And you have to keep ahead of the curve of that.
And from a purely Seacom point of view, going forward, do you have any projects in the pipeline, any M&A activity going forward that you can tell us about?
So M&A activity, we're constantly on the lookout for organizations that are complementary to us. You would have seen previously we'd done specific acquisitions. One was of the EOH network services business that we brought into the organization. And that was to fill a particular area of the business. In our enterprise space, we needed a different type of skill set in that. They had the skill set. They dealt in that space previously. So we brought that on board. We did some acquisitions in East Africa previously, and those were pure infrastructure acquisitions. And as we build out our portfolio, we look at niche acquisitions all over the place that complement what we do from an infrastructure perspective as well as a services perspective.
Okay. The business itself as well, from an HR point of view, you've had a few changes towards primarily towards the end of last year. How has that impacted your strategy and your operations going forward, if at all?
Well, our strategy has been pretty solid over the last couple of years, and we've been executing it over that strategy, or to that strategy rather. But with the changes, this industry always has changes.
Yes.
But I do think, when you look at the organization from a core perspective of the organization, we have so much of resilience built in.
Yes.
And the mere fact that across all levels of the organization, pretty much everyone in the organization's bought into the strategy and is executing against that strategy. So having changes across the organization doesn't really impact the momentum that we've gained from executing on the strategy. And, we've pretty much changed who we are as an organization. Lots of people know us as a subsea company. We haven't just been a subsea company from inception. We've probably over the last 6 years now been in the enterprise space anyway. But still, when you talk to many people across the board, they still look at us as a subsea company. So that was part of the reason for the managed services acquisition, to bring much more of a flair to enterprise, as much as we've played in enterprise. And we've been executing on those strategies. So the fact that the organization is on board and the staff in the organization have been on board, executing on the strategy, whether we have changes at sort of senior management level or not, as long as we haven't fundamentally changed the strategy, the plans will continue to execute. And the other reality of that as well is that the people that we have brought on board now are also seasoned people in this industry. They've been in this industry for a long time. It's not that they're new to the industry. They've worked across multiple organizations. They understand both it from an infrastructure perspective as well as a services perspective. Yeah. So bringing them on board hasn't really had major effects on us.
That's very interesting. So maybe we can just turn our attention a little bit towards the aspect of future-proofing your network going forward, network infrastructures. I think it would be very good for our viewers to know a little bit about, from your side of things, how to future-proof their networks. Is there some advice as far as that?
Yeah, so, typically when someone buys a service, price becomes the major factor.
Yes.
One of the major decision criteria is around price. What you'll find over this last while, specifically, and was highlighted with these issues or these outages that we've had recently, when you start to look at price and you're totally isolated, price goes out the window. And, we've built our network over the years, understanding that environment intricately, dealing in that environment intricately. And so I do think when you start to look at organizations that have inbuilt resiliency. And as much as it's been a cost-sensitive market, what does it really cost for your business to be down for 3 or 4 days?
Yeah.
Then the price conversation is very, very different.
Takes on a different slant.
Absolutely. And, we've had the ability, and you would have seen in these outages that we've had recently as well, we've had the ability to pivot very quickly and restore services across multiple areas of our network. And that's primarily because we've made the right investments up front. We didn't have to be totally reliant on vendors to do upgrades for us. It's well within our control, both at an equipment level as well as a bandwidth level. And we strive very hard to be in control of those types of things. As much as it may not be our underlying infrastructure, as an example, we haven't laid that fiber, but we have services on that fiber.
Yes.
We go to great lengths to make sure we control the bandwidth on that fiber. So we have the ability to move that around. So I think from a client perspective, clients need to look at organizations that have that inbuilt capability in the way they build their networks, not single links and those types of things. Often you'll find that you compete on price.
Yes.
And typically at an SLA level, one should only look at an SLA when the relationship totally broken down, realistically. Because the SLA is there just as a guiding principle. Someone buys a service not for a 99% SLA, the expectation is it'll be up 100% of the time. That's pretty much what someone's buying a service for. They're not buying it for anything below 100%. And you want to look at SLAs then when things start to go horribly wrong. But if your traffic is rerouted seamlessly to you, like if you look at us at an IP network level or at an internet traffic level, through all these outages that we've had, our traffic's just automatically rerouted. We didn't have to go in and configure anything. We didn't have to do any of that.
Right.
So it was totally seamless to our end users. The only thing they would have seen is increased latency because the paths that we took were longer. And the reason we took those paths is the shorter paths were broken. But that's what it comes down to. So those are the areas I think you need to start to look at when you start to build these networks. And as a client, when you're purchasing these networks, understand who the underlying provider is. Do they have sufficient redundancy in their network? Do they invest properly in their networks as well?
Right. It's very interesting. I think I'd just like to ask you one more question, which is what is the vision for Seacom going forward in the next, say, year or two? Do you have any sort of core objectives that you want to achieve?
So if you look at our sort of strat line for Seacom, Digitally Connected Africa, and if you look at our strategy, that's exactly what we execute on. So Seacom will be a Pan-African organization. Today we only operate in East Africa and Southern Africa. And what you will see going forward is, as we expand to other territories, we'll start to look at various aspects on, for the sort of forthcoming years, we'll continue on that infrastructure journey that we're on. We'll couple that with a whole bunch of services that we deliver. I know in the services industry, it's very much a philosophy of build once and replicate many times over. And for us, we're fortunate because we have such a large presence in East Africa and highly skilled staff in East Africa, similar to what we have in South Africa, large presence in South Africa, highly skilled staff in South Africa. We have the ability to create product in both regions and just transfer those products between the regions and whatever makes sense across the entire value stack, whether it's at an infrastructure level or a bandwidth level, to connectivity, to cloud services, backup services, cybersecurity, managed WAN, managed LAN, all of those sort of areas.
Yeah.
So we have that capability that we start to deliver on. And over the next 2 years, we'll continue to do that. But what's key for us is that in certain territories, we need to be in control of the underlying infrastructure. Because irrespective of what services we run above the connectivity layer, connectivity becomes key to delivering any of those services. And the ability to manage that connectivity quite closely, and which we've proven over the years. We have the ability to manage connectivity quite closely. We've proven in the recent outages we have the ability to manage connectivity closely and make it fairly seamless to the end user. So we'll continue with that philosophy as we expand across the continent.
So there's things that you can do or Seacom can do, and there's things that clients and customers can do to mitigate the risks. And just going back to that point a little bit more, is the natural issues or issues of nature that's going to happen whether there's infrastructure or not. But what other causes do you think are that business leaders should be aware of going forward on in terms of breakages?
Yeah, so the one area that we are seeing a lot of recently, not just recently, over the past sort of 10, 12 months, I suppose, vandalism is on the up. And we're not just seeing it, we're starting to see it in East Africa. We've seen it for a long time in South Africa. So I think as an industry, we need to get together and understand how we deal with vandalism. Because that you're going to start to see a major increase on, I think. And, I think the economic situation in the country drives a lot of that.
Yes.
The fact that there's a secondary industry for cables drives a lot of that. But it's also an education thing because, if you look at, and I think it comes down to the fact that lots of people still believe it's copper cable out there, so you have the ability to sell the copper.
Yeah.
So it's an education, but it's also sort of complementary technologies on the ability to secure that infrastructure and understand where the problems are and not let those activities and build your network in such a fashion that if you are going to have vandalism, do you have the ability to use alternative parts to be able to cater for that? So I think that's important. And I think as an industry, whichever region it's in, you need to work closely together to try and mitigate that. It's not a them and us and my cable system is up, I couldn't care if yours is down sort of thing.
Yes.
We saw a lot of that and we collaborated with a whole bunch of people. When we had this last subsea outage, we collaborated with a whole bunch of competitors. And the primary objective of that was to get connectivity up, not whether you could sell more services here or sell more services. The primary objective was how do we get connectivity up? And then the other things tend to flow from that. Because bear in mind, some of these outages are fairly short outages.
Yes.
So you want to be able to cater for that as an industry.
That makes sense. Thank you ever so much, Prenesh. I think that's all we have time for, but I really appreciate your time this afternoon and being with us. So that's all from ITWeb TV for now, but keep watching. My name's Tredger. Have a good afternoon.